The day they read the will, 9 people laughed at a 63-year-old widow. That widow was me. October of 1885, the back room of Mercer and Vale Mercantile, Medora, Dakota Territory. The room smelled of tobacco and old sawdust, and the particular brand of collective satisfaction that gathers when people sense something embarrassing is about to happen to someone they've quietly resented. 2 store clerks had positioned themselves behind the counter under the pretense of sorting iron nails, their hands barely moving, their eyes sharp. 3 ranch hands occupied the flour barrels in the corner, a flask passing between them in that slow, unhurried way that meant they had nowhere else to be and intended to stay. The Methodist preacher's wife stood near the window with her gloved hands clasped at her waist, the posture of a woman who considers herself a witness rather than a participant in whatever cruelty the afternoon might produce. 2 boarding house women occupied the far wall, heads bent together, whispering behind cupped hands. The town constable had pulled a crate to the center of the room and had his boots up on it like a man settling in for theater. Mrs. Ada Mercer stood at the center of all of it. She was the probate custodian, the merchant's widow, a woman whose jawline had the permanent set of someone who had decided long ago that softness was a liability she couldn't afford. She wore black bombazine as though attending a funeral, which in her estimation she was. The document in her hands was 2 pages folded once. She read it aloud in the flat, deliberate tone of a person who understands that the power of what she is saying comes not from inflection but from fact. Then she folded it back along its crease, looked me directly in the eyes, and her mouth pulled into something that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. Your sister has left you 12 acres of wind, a dying stand of cottonwood, and a shack fit for storing turnips. She let that settle for exactly 1 breath. Even the dead can hand a woman a joke. The ranch hands laughed loudest. One of them slapped his knee hard enough that the sound carried across the room. The boarding house women stopped pretending to whisper and simply laughed. The constable grinned at his boots. Even the clerks allowed themselves smiles they didn't bother to hide. I was standing with my hands at my sides and 93 cents in my coat pocket. 1 carpet bag with a change of dress, a hairbrush, and a borrowed almanac I hadn't yet returned to the lending shelf at the post office. I had nowhere to sleep that night. I had been a widow for 11 months, and in those 11 months, I had learned that the world has a remarkable capacity to find a 63-year-old woman both pitiable and tiresome at precisely the same moment. My husband George had died the previous November from the kind of lung illness that starts as a cough and ends as a rattle audible from 2 rooms away. He had been a decent man and a moderate farmer, and he had left behind what most decent moderate men leave when they go unexpectedly: a house with a mortgage. The bank had no interest in renegotiating 3 years of unpaid feed bills in the memory of a life that had been comfortable enough while it lasted. The house went to the bank in February. The furniture followed in March. By April, I had learned the precise arithmetic of what a woman owns when a marriage ends and the debts are settled, and the answer was 93 cents and whatever she could fit into a single bag. My son William lived in Bismarck. He had written 4 months after George died a letter that began with the right words in the right order and ended with an invitation that was not quite one. He wanted me to come and stay with his family. His wife Ellen was expecting their 3rd child. They had a spare room off the kitchen that had good light in the mornings. He was careful to include all of this and equally careful not to say the thing underneath it. The thing any woman who has lived long enough could read between every paragraph: that coming to stay meant arriving as a burden and remaining as one sleeping in the kitchen room, and being grateful for the good morning light, watching other people's children grow, and calling it a life. My daughter Frances lived in Minneapolis. She had not written at all. The night before the reading of Agnes's will, I sat in the room I was renting from Mrs. Ruth Danby's boarding house, $2 a week, meals not included, and read William's most recent letter for the 3rd time. He had written it 2 weeks earlier after word reached him that Agnes had died and left something to me. Mother, there is no practical reason to go look at that land. You are not a young woman. You are not a woman who has ever farmed or built or done anything that would make 12 acres of bad country useful. Sell whatever can be sold, if anything can, and come home. He had underlined the word home, which told me he believed it to be the correct one. I sat with that letter in my hand and felt something I had not felt in almost a year. Not grief, not loneliness, not the dull, enduring tiredness of a widow, making calculations about what she can still afford. I felt anger. Clean and specific, the kind that has a point to it. It was the healthiest thing I had felt since George's funeral, and I held on to it. I had been a school teacher for 20 years, first in a one-room building in Cass County, and later in the schoolhouse outside Medora, where I taught reading and arithmetic and geography to the children of farmers who believed education was a luxury that ended at the fourth grade. I read everything, not novels, not poetry, though I had read those too in their season. I read almanacs and seed catalogs and railroad land circulars and stove installation manuals and back issues of Popular Science Monthly that someone had donated to the school in a box that also contained a broken compass and a jar of dried beans. I read the technical reports posted at the county agricultural office. I read the back pages of farming journals that nobody else seemed to finish. George had called it an admirable peculiarity. Mrs. Danby called it vanity. The county superintendent of schools had once told me, not unkindly, that my habit of reading outside my subject made me a difficult woman to place because I had opinions about things women were not generally expected to have opinions about. He was not wrong. I had opinions. I had them about soil drainage and stove flue design and the thermal properties of different grades of building chinking and the relationship between prevailing wind direction and interior temperature loss in single-room structures. I had developed most of these opinions alone, reading by lamplight after the school day ended, and I had shared almost none of them because I had learned early that a woman who knows more than the room expects creates a particular kind of discomfort that serves nobody. Standing in the back room of Mercer and Vale Mercantile, while 9 people finished laughing at my inheritance, I was not thinking about any of that. I was thinking about something smaller and sharper. Mrs. Mercer had said the words dying stand of cottonwood, and somewhere between that phrase and the constable's grin, something had happened in my mind. A stillness first, and then behind it a kind of light. Firewood. Walls. Warmth. The words connected to each other in a way I could feel but not yet explain, a chain whose far end I couldn't see from where I was standing. I didn't know what my sister Agnes had been doing in that cabin for 22 winters. I didn't know what she had figured out or how far she had gotten, but I knew with that particular certainty that arrives before understanding and stays after it that I was going to find out. I left Medora 2 days later. Mrs. Mercer did not try to stop me. She had the look of a woman relieved to have a complication resolve itself without requiring her direct involvement. I hired Harlan Webb to drive me south. He was a freight hauler who owed a favor to the livery stable owner and was willing to discharge it by transporting a widow in her carpet bag 9 miles down a bad road without conversation. He had a face like cured leather and a habit of squinting at the horizon that suggested he had spent most of his life watching for weather coming from directions other people hadn't thought to check. The road south started with the false confidence of a good intention. Packed earth-clear wagon ruts, the kind of track a person could follow without thinking. I sat in the back of the cart with my bag in my lap and watched Medora diminish behind us, and I thought about what I was doing in the practical terms a woman without resources must always apply. 93 cents. No food beyond a heel of bread and a small wedge of hard cheese from Mrs. Danby's kitchen that I hadn't asked permission to take. No tools beyond what Agnes might have left. 63 years old, and the last physical labor I had performed beyond the regular work of keeping a house was moving a load of school books from the old building to the new one, 12 years before a task that had left my shoulders aching for a week. After the first 4 miles, the road began its slow betrayal. The ruts got shallow, then uncertain, then gone. The track narrowed until the cottonwood branches along its edges scraped both sides of the cart with a sound like fingers dragged across a washboard. Harlan had not looked back at me once, and he did not look back now. The land began to change in ways I had no language for yet. The flat agricultural country of the river valley simply stopped, and what replaced it looked as though the earth had been under enormous pressure for a very long time and had finally given way along 1,000 different lines at once. The little Missouri breaks opened around us like the interior of something vast that had broken open and never closed. The river had carved the plateau into a maze of buttes and coulees, exposed layers of clay and scoria, striped in rust and gray, and a dull yellow the color of old bone. From a distance, it looked like a place where God had started building something ambitious and walked away in the middle of the project. Up close, it looked worse. The clay walls bled color when wet, and the wind moved through the cuts and draws with a sound that was less like wind and more like pressure, something pushing against the inside of the terrain from below. The draw appeared in the last hour before dark, a shallow fold in the bluffs sheltered on three sides by eroded clay ridges with a stand of cottonwood and box elder, running along what had once been a creek bed and was now dry ground with the ghost of water, visible in the way the vegetation followed its old path. The trees were not impressive. They were crooked and wind-bent, their barks split in long vertical lines, their upper branches stripped of smaller growth by years of exposure. I understood seeing them exactly why the town called it Agnes's kindling patch. They had the look of trees that had been in a long argument with the weather and had not been winning. The cabin sat at the base of the draw where the cottonwoods grew thickest. One room, perhaps 12 by 14 feet, with a roof that sagged along its center ridge and walls of logs fitted without enough care and chinked with material that had been falling out in sections for years. The stovepipe leaned east, held in position by a wire and what appeared to be optimism. The door had swelled so badly in its frame that Harlan had to put his shoulder against it twice before it gave. Inside, the smell arrived before anything visual could register. Mouse nests and old ash in something damp that had been damp so long it had become part of the character of the air, rather than a temporary condition of it. The floor was packed earth with a scatter of planks laid over the worst spots. The stove was a small box model, rusted at the seams but intact. One south window was covered with greased paper over a cracked pane that admitted a smear of gray light roughly the size and quality of a winter cloud. A bed frame of rough-cut poles stood against the east wall. A table near the center wobbled when I touched it. On the shelf, 3 tin cups in a cookpot with a hole punched through its bottom that served equally well as neither cookware nor decoration. Harlan set my carpet bag just inside the door and went no further, as though there were a threshold beyond which the terms of his obligation didn't extend. He looked at the room with the expression of a man who has seen worse and is choosing not to say so. "You sure about this?" The words came out flat without investment in any particular answer. I was not sure about anything. The document in my bag said this rotting room in a dead-end draw belonged to me, and that was the entirety of my certainty. "I'm sure." He left before full dark. I stood in the doorway and listened to the cart creak back up the track until the sound diminished into nothing the way sounds do in open country, leaving only the wind in the cottonwoods. That wind made a sound like a knife being drawn along a whetstone, rhythmic and patient, and beneath it the cabin produced the settling noises of a building that had been empty for 3 years and had grown unaccustomed to the weight of another person inside it. I did not sleep that first night. I sat on the edge of the bed frame with my coat still on and my bag between my feet, and I thought about the 9-mile walk back to Medora. I could start at first light and arrive by mid-morning. Mrs. Danby might rent me the room again for another week, and within a week I could find kitchen work or laundry work or the kind of work that comes to women who are presentable and capable and willing to make themselves useful and invisible in equal measure. I had survived 11 months of widowhood by being exactly that, and I could survive more of it. The thought was not comforting. It was simply available. What kept me in that chair was not courage. I want to be precise about this because calling it courage would be an easy inflation that makes the moment sound better than it felt. It was not faith or determination or any quality that sounds cleaner in retrospect. It was the word cottonwood still making its connections in the back of my mind, still following its chain, and the fact that I could not stop it. I was up before dawn. The structure was worse in daylight than it had been in the dimness of the evening before. The northwest corner had settled so severely that the bottom wall log had separated from the floor level, and the top log had pulled away from the roof beam, leaving a gap near the ceiling, through which I could see the gray, pre-dawn sky with complete clarity. The chinking between the logs had failed in long sections in multiple places, leaving openings wide enough to fit my fingers through, and the wind found every one of them without effort. The stove worked barely. I built a small fire from the driest dead branches I could collect from the protected side of the cottonwood stand and crouched in front of it and watched what the heat did. It rose straight up and went out through the roof or the walls or the failed chinking or whatever combination of openings the structure offered. The room near the fire was warmer than the room away from it, but only just, and the margin was narrow enough that I understood without calculation how a person could burn through a cord of wood in a single hard month and still wake to frost on their blankets. I was not watching the fire for warmth. I was watching it as a teacher watches a student make an error with attention and without judgment and with a question already forming. Where is all the heat going? The floor under the sleeping platform made a sound when I walked across it. Not rot, not the soft yielding of damaged wood, but something harder and emptier, a hollow resonance that didn't match the packed earth everywhere else in the room. I stopped and stood on the spot and pressed my weight down deliberately and heard it again. Hollow, not damaged, as though something had been removed from beneath the surface or had never been there. I got down on my hands and knees and looked at the planks more carefully. They had been nailed with more care than the rest of the construction, which was itself a kind of message. One corner was different from the others, the nail heads worn smooth in a way that spoke of repeated handling the edge of the board, showing a slight gap that hadn't come from warping, but from use. Someone had lifted this plank many times and always replaced it. I worked my fingernails under the edge of that board and pulled. It came up easily, as though it remembered being moved and had no objection to being moved again. The second plank came up after it. The third. Beneath them, in the space between the floor joists and the packed earth wrapped in oilcloth that had kept out most of the damp without managing all of it, was a wooden box made of pine boards and sealed with cut nails at every joint. My hands were shaking when I lifted it out. Not from the cold, though the cold was real, from something I had not yet named and would not try to name until I understood what was inside. The oilcloth came away and left damp rings on my coat. The box lid had been nailed shut, but the nails had been chosen for easy removal, ring shanks set shallow, the kind a person drives knowing they will need to draw them again. I worked them free with the point of my belt knife, amahamu. Inside 9 notebooks, ledger-sized, their covers warped slightly with age but their bindings intact. 2 maps, hand-drawn on brown paper, showing the territorial wind patterns above the Little Missouri, with compass marks and seasonal annotations in a small, precise hand. A carpenter's rule made of hardwood with brass fittings tarnished to brown, its edge marked in pencil with measurements and notations that meant nothing to me yet, but had the appearance of meaning the tight, orderly look of a system being built over time. And beneath all of it, a packet of folded papers tied with cotton twine, the pages dried to the color of old cream, each one addressed in the same hand as the wind maps. I looked at the notebooks first. They were numbered, but not by year or month or any calendar sequence I recognized. The first cover said first cold. The second said seconds cold. The third said after the blue norther. The fourth said the one that killed the Anderson stock. They were dated by winters, not by years, by events, by the specific character of individual seasons, as though whoever kept them had decided that the calendar was too imprecise an instrument for measuring the things she was measuring. Someone had lived in this cabin and counted time by how many times she had survived. I opened the first notebook. The handwriting was small and even and filled every line with the efficient density of someone who understood that paper was finite and thoughts were not. I read the first sentence and could not move past it for several minutes. A thin wall is a promise to the wind. I sat down on the floor with my back against the cold, curved logs and read until the light failed. Her name, written inside the front cover of the first notebook, was Agnes Holt, my sister. A woman I had not seen in more than 30 years, who had left the family home when I was in my 20s under circumstances that our relatives had described variously as a disappointment, an eccentricity, and proof of what happened when a woman was allowed to develop ideas larger than her situation. She had been strange, everyone said. She had been difficult. She had gone west and stayed west and sent letters that nobody answered because nobody knew what to say to a woman who had chosen a failing timber claim in the Dakota breaks over the ordinary life available to her. She had lived in this cabin for 22 winters, not because she could not leave, because she was trying to understand something, and the understanding required 22 winters of staying still inside the problem. The notebooks were the most complete scientific record I had ever held in my hands, and I had spent 20 years in a schoolroom. Agnes had measured temperature at floor level every morning for 12 consecutive winters, logging each reading in a table that ran down the right margin of each page. She had recorded the rate of heat dissipation from the stove, depending on wind direction, with notes about the relationship between north wind velocity and the cold air pooling she observed near the base of the east wall. She had sketched the cracks in the chinking every spring and compared those sketches year over year at building a map of the cabin's structural decay with a precision that would have impressed any engineer who happened upon it, had any engineer ever thought to look. What she was studying at the root of it was failure. Not her own, not the personal failure the town had assigned to her. The failure of the structure. How heat escaped. Where walls failed. What happened to a small room when winter arrived with force and the logs were thin and the wind found every gap regardless of what was done to stop it. She had approached it with the systematic patience of someone who understood that the question was important and the answer would not come quickly, and that quick answers to important questions were generally wrong. This cabin loses warmth the way a man loses blood from a gut wound, she had written in the notebook marked fourth cold. Slow and steady and fatal if you don't find the wound. I have spent 4 winters finding it. She had found it. The wound was the walls themselves. The logs were not thick enough to hold heat. The chinking fell out every season, regardless of what material she used or how carefully she applied it. The gaps that formed let in wind that moved through the room and carried warmth away faster than any stove could replace it. She had tried every solution the frontier knew rechinking with different compounds, hanging wool blankets against the worst walls banking snow along the exterior base. None of them held because none of them addressed the fundamental problem, which was that a log wall built at this thickness in this climate was architecturally insufficient for the purpose of keeping a person alive through January. Then she started trying something else. In the notebook labeled 7th Cold, she had drawn a diagram of the cabin from above a simple overhead sketch with dimensions marked. Around the inside perimeter of all 4 walls, she had drawn a thick, dark line. The line carried a label in her small, precise hands, stacked wood split, face inward, floor to roof. Next to the diagram, she had written a paragraph that I read 3 times before I trusted what it was saying. Dead air is better than moving air. Wood does not conduct heat the way stone does, nor the way metal does. A stacked cord of split wood against an interior wall creates air pockets between every piece, and those pockets do not move, and air that does not move cannot carry warmth away. The gap between the wood stack and the log wall behind it creates another dead air space that stops conduction before it begins. What if the fuel itself became the wall before it became the fire? What if the same material that would eventually warm the room first acted as the barrier that made the warming possible at all? She had measured the results before and after. The north wall, which had been the worst, showed frost forming on its interior surface during the coldest January nights before the experiment. After stacking 3 courses of split wood against it face inward with a consistent hand-width gap between the stacked wood and the logs behind the frost stopped appearing on the interior surface. The wood behind the stack remained dry. The stove heat stayed in the room. Not perfectly, not completely, but measurably. A 30-degree difference in overnight floor temperature with identical stove use and identical fuel quality. 30 degrees in a single-room structure in a Dakota winter is not a comfort improvement. It is the distance between waking up and not. I read that section 4 times. Then I read the temperature tables in the notebook margins and compared them to the tables in the 4th Cold before the experiment began. The numbers were not subtle and they were not open to interpretation. Agnes had not discovered magic. She had worked out a physical principle that anyone who had studied thermodynamics would have recognized immediately had anyone who studied thermodynamics ever found themselves trying to survive in a 12 by 14-foot log cabin 9 miles from the nearest town. Wood has a lower thermal conductivity than stone or metal. Stacked split wood creates dead air pockets between the pieces. Still air does not carry heat away through convection because convection requires movement. She had built an insulated secondary wall from the same material she was going to burn anyway, delaying its use as fuel only until it had first served as shelter. She had not finished. The last notebook marked 22nd Cold was only half filled. The final entry was dated January of 1882. The handwriting was the same as it had always been, small, even unhurried, which told me that whatever had ended the work had not given her warning. After that entry, white pages, waiting for winters that never came to fill them. I looked up from the notebooks and looked at the cabin walls. Thin logs, gaps in the chinking wind coming through as though the room had no barrier at all in certain places. Then I looked past the window at the cottonwood stand in what remained of the afternoon light, its crooked trees casting crooked shadows across the clay ridges of the draw. Something lit inside me that was not a small thing. I had not yet examined the packet of papers at the bottom of the box. I lifted them out by their twine binding and sat with them a moment before I understood what I was holding. They were not sealed envelopes, but folded sheets. Draft copies that Agnes had made of letters she intended to mail the record a careful correspondent keeps of what has been said. The addresses on each were written in her hand, Clara Holt Medora. Post office care of Ada Mercer. 2 letters, both directed to me, both retained here as working copies. The originals had been sent north sealed and addressed through the postal agency that Ada Mercer managed. Whether those originals had completed their journey or come to rest in a desk drawer in the back of the Mercantile was a question these drafts could not answer for me. I opened the first copy. Agnes had written 6 pages. She had described the cabin and the land and the work she had been doing there in the direct, undecorated language of someone who expected to be understood. She described the notebooks and the experiment and the results of the first 6 winters in terms precise enough that I could follow the reasoning without difficulty, because she had written them for someone she expected would follow the reasoning without difficulty. 3/4 of the way through the first letter, she had written a line that I read and then read again, and then sat with for a long time without reading anything further. You were always the one in the family who read the catalogs instead of the novels, and I always thought that meant you and I were the same kind of person even when we were very different people, and I think the work I have been doing here needs exactly that kind of person to finish it. She had known, across 30 years of distance and silence, she had known what kind of mind I had, and she had decided that this particular work required precisely that kind. Not any warm body with a strong back, not any relative who might accept an inheritance out of financial desperation. Me specifically, because she believed I would understand what she had been doing and why it mattered and what needed to be done with it next. The second draft was shorter. Written March of 1882, it carried the quality of something composed by a person who understands that time has become unreliable. She had not finished the system she wrote. 2 walls completed, the third begun, but the physical work had grown difficult in ways she hadn't anticipated, and she was not certain she would finish before the next winter came. She was not asking for rescue. She was asking for continuation. She wanted someone to take the notebooks and the tools and the land and the work and carry it forward, because the work was real and the results were real, and the only thing lacking was a second person willing to believe that. What saves you in a hard country is often the thing people laugh at before they understand it. I have been laughed at for 20 years. I am used to it. But the work should not be laughed at. The work is correct. I set the second draft on my knee and looked at the addresses again. The originals had passed through Ada Mercer's hands. I was now as certain of that as I was of anything. Mercer managed the postal agency. She had stood in that back room and called my inheritance a joke, and she had possessed for years 2 letters from a dead woman to her living sister that would have changed the shape of everything. It did not matter which of the possible versions was true, whether she had read them and decided the delivery wasn't worth her trouble, or had set them aside and forgotten, or had made a deliberate choice. The result was identical in every version. Agnes had written twice, and the letters had arrived in Medora, and they had stopped there, and I had spent 6 years since 1879 being arranged into other people's spare rooms and other people's charitable accommodations without knowing that my sister had been reaching toward me from this draw the entire time. I thought about what those 6 years had contained: the years in the county school, George's decline, the long winter of his dying, the settling of debts and the loss of the house, and arriving in Medora with a carpet bag and 93 cents and no particular destination. I thought about Mrs. Danby's kitchen room and William's underlined word, and the way my whole situation, viewed from the back room of Mercer and Vale Mercantile that morning, had the appearance of a conclusion. I was not angry in the way that destroys. I was angry in the way that clarifies. It is a different thing entirely. I picked up the carpenter's rule from where it had rested across my knee throughout the reading and turned it over in my hands. Agnes had marked the edge with measurements in wood species notations, and gap width calculations for the dead air space. She had left me the knowledge and the tools and the timber and the land. She had left me everything the work required. The only thing she had not been able to leave was the time she had lost, and there is nothing to be done about lost time except to stop losing more of it. I stacked the notebooks in the pine box with the maps and the draft letters. I put the carpenter's rule in my coat pocket. I looked at the four walls of the cabin in the near-dark, thin logs failing, chinking wind, finding every opening with patient efficiency, and I made the only decision that the contents of that box made available to a woman who had spent 20 years reading catalog thermodynamics by lamplight and still believed in the face of considerable evidence. To the contrary, that understanding how things actually worked was the most useful inheritance a person could carry. I was going to finish what Agnes had started. I was going to finish it because the work was correct and because she had wanted me specifically and because 93 cents in a carpet bag and 9 miles of worsening road in the other direction were not reasons to stop. They were the shape of the obstacle. An obstacle has a shape so that you can find the way around it. I did not sleep that second night either, but I was not thinking about Medora. The cold arrived the way Agnes's notebooks had promised it would not, as a single event but as a series of surrenders, each one smaller than the last, until the cumulative weight of them became something I had to decide about. November came in sideways, driven by a northwest wind that found the gaps in the chinking with the efficiency of something that had been practicing for years. I had spent October doing the preliminary work pulling the floor runners Agnes had sketched in the sixth notebook from salvaged lumber I'd hauled by hand from a collapsed outbuilding. Half a mile up the draw, its boards gray and dry and better than anything I could have cut from green timber. The runners went in first, 4 of them parallel to each wall at 18 inches out from the log surface, raised 2 inches off the packed earth on flat stones I'd levered from the creek bed, with a pry bar I found in the corner of the cabin, buried under a collapsed shelf. I had done all of this before I touched a single piece of the cottonwood stand, because Agnes's instructions had been clear on the sequence, and I'd learned in 20 years of teaching that children who skipped steps produced work that fell apart at exactly the moment it was supposed to hold. I felled the first cottonwood on a Tuesday in October, and it nearly broke me. Not from the tree itself, which was not large, but from the sustained effort of what followed it. Swinging an axe is a young person's work when you're doing it for hours. I was not young. My shoulders burned through the first morning and ached through the second, and by the third day had moved into a territory past pain into something more like a permanent condition of my upper body that I simply had to accommodate. I split through the burn. I stacked through it. I went to bed with my hands wrapped in strips torn from an old flannel shirt I'd found in Agnes's things, and I woke up and did it again. By the first week of November, I had the north wall begun 3 courses of split cottonwood, face inward with the gap Agnes had specified between the wood and the log surface behind. 3 courses was not a wall. It was a beginning and an argument. The argument was with the wind, which continued to enter the room from the east and the west, and the south with complete indifference to the single partial stack on the northern side. The first deep freeze came on the 8th of November. I had been prepared for cold in the way a person who has read about something is prepared for it, which is to say not at all in the ways that matter most. The difference between knowing that minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit is dangerous and waking at 4 in the morning with the air inside your shelter at 12 degrees above zero is the difference between a map of a place and standing in it. I lay in the darkness and felt the cold as a physical presence, with weight and intention pressing down from above and pushing up through the packed earth floor and coming in sideways through every failure in the structure, and I understood for the first time what Agnes had meant by the gut wound comparison. It wasn't dramatic, it was slow. It was the room simply and steadily giving up. I went through December the way a person goes through something they have decided to survive rather than something they expect to enjoy. I lost weight I didn't have. My hip bones left bruises on the mattress, padding from sleeping on my side, and I registered this only because turning over required enough effort to wake me, and being woken made me think about being awake, and being awake at 2 in the morning in a 12-degree room is a particular kind of loneliness that has no adequate description. I thought about William's letter every night, not because I wanted to accept what it had offered, but because it had been the last written evidence that anyone expected me to exist tomorrow. I trapped one rabbit badly and cried while cleaning it because my hands shook from cold and exhaustion, and the knife slipped twice, and I was 63 years old and alone in a draw in the Dakota Breaks, trying to skin something for dinner by lamplight. And there are moments when the full absurdity of a situation arrives without warning and sits down next to you and refuses to leave. I ate everything, the liver, which I didn't like, and the legs, which I did, and a broth made from the bones that stretched into 3 meal if I was careful about it. I found dried choke cherries still hanging on branches on the sheltered side of the clay ridges, their skins wrinkled to leather, but the flesh still yielding. I dug wild onions from ground that required a fire set directly on the surface to soften it enough to work a stick into. I found a stand of dried rose hips on a south-facing slope and collected every one, eating them on the walk home because carrying them would have required a pocket I didn't have free. It was in this context, hungry cold hands cracked at the knuckles and bleeding into the mittens I wore to sleep, that I read the line from the ninth notebook that changed the arithmetic. 3 in the morning, the January of 1886 temperature, in the room somewhere between 15 and 17 degrees above zero, by the small thermometer I'd hung near the stove. The lamp was turned low to save oil. Agnes had written the line near the end of a detailed account of a 3-day blizzard during her second winter. Do not burn through your safety reserve all at once. Some of the wood belongs in the wall, for it belongs in the stove, and the order of that cannot be reversed without cost. Below it, she had done the calculation, same outside temperature, same stove size, and fuel type, same duration of burning. Room with no insulated wall, overnight temperature loss of 22 degrees. Room with completed north and west walls, overnight temperature loss of 9 degrees, less than half. Not because the stove worked better or the fuel was superior, because the heat had somewhere to stay. I sat with the notebook on my knees and let the arithmetic settle into my bones. The cold wasn't a fuel problem. I hadn't grasped this completely before, not in the full mechanical sense of it. I had understood the principle as a concept would, as insulation before it became fuel, but I had not understood it yet as an explanation for my own suffering. The heat I was generating was being taken away faster than I was creating it. Every stick I fed into the stove was fighting the temperature differential across the thin walls, not banking against the future, not accumulating into warmth that would hold through the night. It was water poured into a bucket with holes. The solution was not more water. The solution was to patch the bucket, and the material for the patches was already stacked in 3 courses against the north wall, waiting for me to understand why they needed to be 10 courses instead. I survived the first winter without completing the system. I survived it by making myself eat things I would not have eaten 6 months before, and by sleeping in every piece of clothing I own, and by keeping the stove loaded from a supply of wood I'd staged inside the door to avoid going outside in the worst of it. I survived it, and I was not grateful for the survival in any warm or philosophical way. I was simply present on the other side of it, which was the same thing for practical purposes. Spring came slowly to the breaks the way it always does in country, where the bluffs and coulees hold shadow long after the open ground is thawed. I started the second phase of the work in the first week of March, when the temperature reliably cleared zero in the afternoons, and I could work outdoors for 3 or 4 hours before the cold drove me back inside. I tore down the 3 north wall courses I'd built in October and started over from the floor runners up, because the original stacking had been done in ignorance and the improved version had to be built correctly or not at all. Agnes's instructions for the stacking sequence were precise split-face inward pieces 16 to 20 inches in length for stability without top heaviness, courses laid level and true so the stack didn't develop a lean that would accelerate in the upper half. I followed them exactly for the first 4 courses. Then I tried my own modification every 4th course, laid perpendicular to the others, cross-hatched, the way my grandfather had stacked hay bales when I was a girl for stability across the face. Agnes hadn't specified this. The notebooks described a stack but not a tied stack, and there was a meaningful difference between the two. When the stack rose above 4 feet, the crosshatch courses locked the structure laterally in a way that vertical-only stacking could not, and when I tested the result by pushing against it from the side with both hands and my full weight, it moved as a unit rather than in sections. That was the difference between furniture and architecture, and I recognized it as an improvement worth keeping. By June, I had the north wall finished floor to ceiling, approximately 3 feet deep at the base, and tapering slightly as it rose. The floor runners had settled into their final positions in the earth under the planking without shifting. I pressed my palm to the interior face of the stack and felt wood at room temperature. I pressed my palm through the gap at floor level to the old log wall behind it and felt cold, even in summer cold, that had nothing to do with the season and everything to do with what the structure was, which was a wall that had never been sufficient for the work asked of it. Agnes was right about the measurements and right about the physics, and neither of those things surprised me by then. What surprised me was the degree. Not a modest improvement, a categorical one. I was in Medora buying lamp oil and salt on a Tuesday afternoon in late July when the encounter with Mrs. Ruth Danby occurred that became in retrospect a small measure of what I was working against. Danby ran the boarding house where I had rented my last room in town, a woman in her mid-40s with the posture of someone who had spent years managing other people's chaos and had developed an excellent bearing as a defense against it. She came across the mercantile floor with the purposeful stride of a person who has something to say and has decided that now is the appropriate time for saying it. Heard you're still out there in Agnes's place. Not a question, just a position. Heard you've got the whole room stuffed with firewood now. Not the whole room. Danby tilted her head with the expression of a woman who has already decided what the truth is and is choosing how much of it to apply directly. Agnes Holt lined her walls with wood like a squirrel gone to madness. People said she intended to roast herself alive in there eventually. You're a reasonable woman, Mrs. Holt. 63 years old is not the age to start living like Agnes Holt. I paid for my supplies. I was not angry. I was past the kind of anger that required an audience. But I carried the conversation back down the road with me the way you carry a stone in your boot, aware of it, unable to stop feeling it against the soul. 63 years old is not the age. I had heard that sentence in various forms since the morning of the will reading, and it operated on a logic that I found genuinely interesting in its consistency. Whatever I was doing, the appropriate response was to note my age and suggest a more suitable diminishment. Read the catalogs at someone else's house. Occupy the spare kitchen room. Be grateful for the morning light. The man leading the roan horse up the draw appeared from the north side of the cottonwood stand at the end of that same afternoon, moving at the pace of someone in no particular hurry who nevertheless intends to arrive. He was near 70, built in the way that men who have done physical labor for 50 years are built, not large, but dense, with the kind of shoulders that suggest the weight they've carried has been absorbed rather than withstood. One white eyebrow grew noticeably longer than the other, which gave his resting expression a quality of permanent skepticism that his actual temperament, I would later learn, did not entirely support. He carried a draw knife on a shoulder strap and a canvas bag on the other that clinked faintly with hardware. He stopped at the edge of the stand and looked at the stovepipe. He looked at it for several seconds with the focused attention of someone reading a document in a language he knows well. Then he looked at me, standing in the cabin doorway, assessing what the situation required. You're Clara Holt. Flat, certain. The way you state a fact you verified before you needed it. I am. I noticed your smoke. He indicated the pipe with a small gesture. It's thin. Your stove's drawing clean. Any stove draws the same when it's loaded right. He shook his head once, not arguing, just correcting. Not the same. What's different is what the room's doing with the heat after it leaves the stove. Your pipe runs thin because the room is holding, not bleeding. He tied the roan to a branch with the efficient nod of someone who has tied horses in bad weather more times than he's counted. Walt Cree, I knew your sister. Mind if I look inside? I minded because what was inside was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with ownership. It was evidence of 2 years of effort and belief, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had been laughed at and had declined to take the laughter as instruction. But I also recognized in the directness of his question a quality I hadn't encountered in Medora, which was genuine interest in what I'd actually done rather than in what I thought I was doing. I stepped aside. He stood in the doorway for longer than most people stand in doorways. He was looking at the north wall with the measuring eye of a man who has spent his life evaluating structural work, not aesthetically but functionally, asking whether it would hold. He walked to the stack and knocked on it with his knuckles in 3 different places, the hard testing knock of someone checking for hollow spots and rot pockets. He crouched and examined the gap between the stacked wood and the log wall behind it at floor level, running his thumb along the edge where the two surfaces nearly met. He checked the floor runners with his fingers, feeling for level and flex. He looked at the ceiling, where the crosshatch courses met the top of the stack, and where I had driven cleats into the overhead beam as a stabilizing measure I'd improvised 3 weeks earlier, when the upper section developed a slight forward lean in the heat of a warm afternoon. He stood up and looked at me with an expression I didn't yet have language for, though I would come to recognize it later as something between assessment and relief, the look of a person who has been waiting for a particular outcome and has arrived to find it present. Your sister was right, quietly, not triumphantly. She was just 20 years early for people to be willing to be told. His name was Walt Cree. He had driven freight to Agnes's draw twice in the years before her death, hauling lumber she'd ordered from a mill in Dickinson for the floor runners she'd designed, but never had the material to build. He had played checkers at her table on 3 different winters when his route took him close enough to the draw to justify the detour. In the winter of 1876, he had helped her reset a partial wall stack that had shifted when a wet spring followed a hard freeze, and in the process of resetting it, he had learned enough about what she was attempting to understand it without fully sharing it. He was not a scientist. He was a man who built things in places where things did not want to stay built, which had given him a working knowledge of why structures failed and what could be done about it that was practical, in a way Agnes's theoretical precision sometimes was not. Agnes had spoken to him before she died. He said it simply without ceremony. She said if her sister ever came to the draw, I should come and help. She said you had the right kind of mind for the work. I didn't know if you'd come. The letters went through Mercer and nobody heard back, so I waited. He had waited 3 years from Agnes's death in 1882 to the morning someone in Medora mentioned that the Holt woman had gone out to her dead sister's claim and was apparently still there. He had organized his freight schedule around the draw, after that coming down from the north 3 times a week when his hip allowed it. What he brought was the engineering complement to Agnes's experimental precision. Agnes had been a meticulous observer, but she had worked alone, and working alone meant that certain categories of knowledge, the kind that comes from building and failing, and building differently from watching structures under load over years, were absent from the notebooks because she'd had no way to acquire them. Walt filled those gaps with the economy of a man who had learned things once and did not need to repeat himself. He showed me how to shim the floor runners at their low points, with flat stones shimmed in pairs so the surfaces remained level as the earth settled beneath them. He showed me the correct placement for ceiling cleats, not at the top of the stack, which was too late for correction, but at 2/3 height, where a lean was still controllable. He demonstrated the gap measurement that made the dead air space thermally effective, without becoming a route for mice, which was a consideration Agnes's notebooks had mentioned without solving. He came when his body allowed it, and not otherwise. Some mornings the walk from Medora was not possible because his left hip locked at the joint in a way that required an hour of heat and movement before it would release. In those mornings he did not come, and I learned not to expect him on schedule. The days he arrived, he worked steadily and without sentiment. And the days he had to stop early because the cough got too deep, he stopped without apology, and neither of us treated it as anything other than a condition of the collaboration. He was 69 years old, and his lungs had been damaged by decades of driving freight through Dakota winters, and the work showed in him the way all accumulated damage shows, not as a sudden thing, but as a consistent thing, a permanent adjustment in what was available. His wife had died in childbirth on the plains near Fort Berthold 30 years before. The baby had died 2 days after. He had buried them together in a single grave and driven freight the following Monday, because there was nothing else to do with grief at that magnitude except put it somewhere it could be carried rather than worn. He had never remarried. The Army freight work had taken the hearing in his right ear through years of working alongside mule teams and artillery wagon columns, and the silence on that side had become such a familiar companion that he sometimes forgot it wasn't available to other people. He said one afternoon, watching me work the carpenter's rule along a course I was preparing to stack, "The land takes, that's what it does out here. The question is whether you take back." He said it without self-pity, as a geological observation, the same way he would have noted the composition of the clay bluffs or the direction of the prevailing wind. I heard in it a symmetry with my own accounting, the house lost to debt, the years of occupying other people's spare spaces, the letters that had traveled from this, draw to a dead end at Ada Mercer's desk, and I did not answer because I didn't need to. We understood each other in the specific way that people understand each other when the thing they have in common is not circumstance, but character. By late August of 1886, the north and west walls were finished. I had started the east wall and expected to finish it before the first hard freeze. The south wall, which faced the cottonwood stand and received less direct wind exposure, I planned to leave for spring. Agnes's notebooks confirmed the south as the least critical barrier. The temperature differential I was measuring every morning in my own log at the back of the 12th cold notebook confirmed it. The floor near the north wall, which had been the coldest point in the room, all of my first winter, was now within 12 degrees of the stove-adjacent floor on the coldest mornings. The west wall had been nearly as bad as the north before I built it out, and its completion had brought the room to a condition that felt for the first time like something a person might reasonably survive in rather than endure through. The setback arrived in October from a direction I hadn't anticipated. A Chinook came down from the mountains on a Thursday, the warm, dry wind that drops off the Rockies into the northern plains in ways that make no meteorological sense from the inside of it, temperatures jumping 40 degrees in less than 2 days. The snow that had accumulated on the exterior north and west sides melting into streams that ran down the logs and pooled against the base of the draw. I woke on the third morning and found the doorside wall had shifted overnight. 8 courses of split cottonwood, the section I'd finished most recently, the wood still carrying some moisture from the stack I'd brought in during the wet week before, had absorbed the humidity change and expanded slightly, and the expansion under the weight of the courses above, it had translated into a 10-degree forward lean that was still moving millimeter by millimeter in the direction of the floor. I spent the entire day restacking that section, pulling it down from the 8th course and rebuilding from the 4th. And while I worked, I thought about what would happen if this occurred during a blizzard rather than a Chinook. A wall failure in the second week of January, when the temperature was below zero and the outside supply of wood was frozen under 3 feet of snow, would not be recoverable. I would not have time to rebuild it before the room temperature dropped below survivable. The wall had to be able to handle moisture variations without losing structural integrity, and the current design did not adequately account for that. I worked through the afternoon and into the evening by lamplight and arrived at a modification Agnes had not included in the notebooks, and that Walt, when I described it to him the following Tuesday, said he'd been thinking about himself. The cross-hatched courses alone were not enough. I added woven lashing of dried willow branches along the face of the door side wall, running through the stacked wood in at 2-foot intervals, and tying back to ceiling cleats. I drove myself with the long spike nails Walt had brought in his canvas bag. I installed upright battens at each corner where 2 walls met, notched into the floor runners and wedged against the ceiling beams so the corner junctions couldn't spread. The modification turned the stack from a structural analogy to a wall into an actual one, a system under tension rather than merely under gravity with failure paths closed off at every logical joint. Walt ran his hand along the completed corner joint the following week, checking the tension in the willow lashing with 2 fingers, the way a person checks a bowstring. Your sister worked alone for 22 years and never got to this. He wasn't diminishing Agnes. He was noting something precise about the difference between what one person could develop in isolation and what 2 people working from that foundation could build beyond it. The observation cost me something to hear because it contained within it the full weight of what the withheld letters had meant, not just to me who had not known to look for Agnes, but to Agnes who had spent 22 winters solving a problem that a second person might have helped her carry across the finish line years earlier. I did not allow myself to stay in that feeling. The feeling was real, and it was not useful, and I had learned in the months since arriving in the draw to distinguish between feelings that were true and feelings that served, because the overlap between those categories was smaller than people generally admitted. The autumn of 1887 had a quality that I only understood in retrospect. It was too warm and too still, the kind of false comfort that winter sometimes offers in the weeks before it demonstrates what it actually intends. The wells held, the grass cured brown and brittle in ways that suggested a long, dry summer rather than an impending crisis. People in Medora put extra cords of wood in their yards and considered themselves prepared and turned their attention to other concerns. Walt did not share the general ease. He watched the northwestern horizon every evening with the focused attention of someone reading a language other people hadn't learned. One evening in late November, sitting on the exterior bench I had built against the south wall of the cabin, during the warm weather, he said, "Hard winters follow comfortable autumns more often than they should. The weather has a way of collecting on what people forget." I had thought he was speaking philosophically. He was not. It was during this autumn that the situation with Silas Roan came to its confrontation. Roan owned the largest woodyard in Medora and the only emergency shelter barn in the county, a converted freight building on the east side of town, where he charged families $1 a night for floor space during storms. He sold hauled wood at prices that reflected his monopoly on hauled wood rather than his cost of providing it, and his arrangement with the local freight routes meant that independent cutting was difficult enough that most families simply paid his rate and considered themselves fortunate to have the option. He was not a villain in the theatrical sense. He was a businessman who had identified a need that was also a vulnerability and had organized his enterprise accordingly, which is a different thing and in some ways a more durable one. Dr. James Carr was the proximate cause of the encounter. He had come to the draw in September to check on Walt, whose cough had entered a new phase that concerned the people in town who had known him longest, and he had stayed an extra hour after the examination to look at the walls. He was a thin man in his early 40s, with spectacles that sat crooked on his nose, and the perpetual expression of someone who has been awake for longer than is strictly advisable. And when he looked at my four walls, he did not look at them the way other visitors had looked at them, which was with the polite confusion of someone encountering something unusual. He looked at them the way I read almanacs, hunting for the structural logic underneath the surface presentation. The secondary shell reduces air infiltration. He was speaking partly to himself and partly to me, working through the mechanics in real time. The dead air space between the shell and the log surface acts as a conductive barrier. The wood itself has low thermal conductivity, which means it doesn't transmit the cold from the outer wall to the interior surface the way stone or metal would. He turned to look at me directly. "Who designed this?" "My sister Agnes. I completed it." I remember Agnes Holt. People in town said she was peculiar. They didn't say she was a thermal physicist. He came back 2 weeks later with a single-page circular he'd written himself, clear language, with a diagram in the top right corner explaining the principle and the construction method in terms that any person who had ever built a fire and wondered where the heat went would be able to follow. He wanted to post it at the Mercantile. If more families understood this, for the hard winters came fewer families would require emergency shelter. The mathematics are straightforward and the physics are sound. The circular was posted on a Wednesday. It was gone by the following Monday. I was buying hardware at the Mercantile counter when Roan found me. He was a large man, broad across the chest, with a beard that covered his jaw and eyes that operated independently of it, revealing more than the beard concealed. He came across the floor with the unhurried pace of a man who doesn't require momentum to project force. "Mrs. Holt." Not a greeting. A positioning. "I hear you've been advising people to pack their rooms with firewood." "I've been describing a construction method that reduces heat loss in single-wall structures." "You keep telling people to pile fuel inside of their walls, and one of them burns their family alive, and I'll see your claim taken by the county as a public danger." He was not raising his voice. He did not need to. "There are established ways to stay warm in this territory. They've worked for 30 years. The established ways killed 4 people in Medora in the winter of 1880 and 7 in the winter of 1883, and those numbers are in the county records if you'd like to verify them." I kept my voice even with the same effort it had taken to keep stacking through the first winters, cold, the same conscious application of will that I was beginning to recognize as the fundamental skill this work required. The established ways include your shelter barn, which charged the Hollenbeck family $1.50 a night in February of last year when their oldest boy had a fever and they needed to get him into a heated space. $1.50 is 2 days of wage work for most of the men in this county. Something shifted in Roan's expression, not retreat but recalibration, the look of a person who has encountered an opponent who has done their homework. He stepped closer. His voice dropped. "Careful, Mrs. Holt. You are a widow living alone in a draw 9 miles from the nearest neighbor. Country like this has a way of being hard on people who make themselves a complication. I looked at him steadily and thought about the gap between a threat and a fact which was approximately the same gap as the one between a wall that held and one that didn't, a matter of design and intention and whether the structure had been built correctly under pressure. Then let the method speak for itself this winter, I said. If it works, you'll know. If it doesn't, the problem solves itself. I walked out of the mercantile with my hardware and the clear understanding that the next thing on the calendar was a winter that would answer both of us and that there was no further argument to be had until it did. Walt was at the cabin when I returned, checking the ceiling cleats on the south wall I'd finished the previous week. I told him about Roan without editorial, and he listened without interruption, his thumb still testing the cleat fastening while I talked. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The frontier trusts what it can see," he said. "It doesn't invest in what might be true. When this room keeps you alive through something that kills the unprepared, they'll understand, not before and not from a paper posted on a wall." He turned back to the cleat and pressed his thumb harder against the wood. "You've built correctly. What comes next is whether or not carpentry. The carpentry part is done." I did not know, standing in that room in November of 1887, how precise his timing was. I did not know that the next test was already forming to the northwest in the cold air masses that had been building for weeks over the Montana high country and were arranging themselves into something the territory had not seen in 50 years. I knew the system was complete. I knew the measurements were right. I knew that Agnes's notebooks had been correct in every particular I'd been able to test, and that the modifications Walt and I had added had addressed the failure modes Agnes hadn't lived long enough to encounter. I knew the room was ready. What I did not yet know was what ready meant when the real thing arrived. Walt appeared at my door in the last hour before dark on January 12th of 1888, having walked the 9 miles from Medora on a hip that had been bad all week because the temperature had been dropping since morning in a way that had nothing to do with the season and everything to do with what was coming behind it. The sky to the northwest had turned a color I had no word for. Not gray, not silver. Something harder than either, the color of something that had made a decision. The cottonwood stand outside was absolutely still in a way that felt less like calm and more like held breath. Walt stood in the doorway and looked at the 4 walls of the completed system. The floor runners, the stacked and tied and cross-hatched and lashed wood filling every wall from sill to beam, the stove positioned in its cleared lane, with the wood supply staged on both sides within arm's reach for restocking through the night. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at me and he said something I carried for the rest of my life without ever needing to write it down. "You are ready," he said. "Most people are not." The temperature began dropping before sunset and did not stop. The wind arrived before midnight, and it arrived without graduation, without the incremental building that weather usually offers as warning. 1 hour the cottonwoods outside were still, and the next they were screaming, the sound coming through the walls as something between a groan and a percussion, the whole structure of the cabin flexing under lateral pressure in a way that made the ceiling beams creaking in a rhythm that had no comfort in it. I lay in my narrow sleeping space and listened to the building negotiate with the storm, and felt for the first time since arriving in the draw genuinely afraid. Not of dying, I had made my peace with that possibility in a general way during the first winter, and had not unmade it since. Afraid that the work was insufficient. Afraid that Agnes's measurements had been right, and my own extensions of them had introduced an error I hadn't caught, and that the error would reveal itself tonight in the form of a collapsed wall, or a failed joint, or a temperature drop I couldn't recover from. The fear was useful in the way that precise fear is always useful. It made me attentive. I got up at 2 in the morning with the candle and walked the perimeter of the room, pressing my palm to the interior face of each wall in turn. North wall wood at a temperature that told me the system was working. Not warm, not what a palm against a heated stove would feel like, but the specific cool dry of material that was absorbing cold on one side and releasing nothing on the other. West wall the same, east wall the same. I crouched at the base of the south wall and pressed my ear against the lowest course and listened for the sound that a shifting structure makes, the subtle tick of compressed fibers realigning under load. Nothing. The willow lashing held. The battens at the corners were set and did not flex when I pressed my weight against the junction. The ceiling cleats had not moved. I lit the lamp and took the temperature at floor level near the stove and then walked to the furthest point from the stove, the northeast corner, and took it there. 11 degrees of difference across the room. In January of the previous year, with no insulated walls at all, the same measurement at the same time of a cold night had shown 28 degrees of difference, the corner so cold that the water in the small crock I kept there had frozen solid by morning. 11 degrees. The heat the stove was generating was staying in the room rather than bleeding through every failure in the log wall into the darkness outside. Not because the stove was working harder, because the room had finally been made capable of holding what was put into it. I did what I had not done in many months. I laughed, a short, involuntary sound, almost surprised, as though the body had decided before the mind did that this was the appropriate response to the gap between what everyone had said this room would do to me and what it was actually doing. Then I sat down on the floor in the northeast corner with my back against the stacked wood and my knees drawn up and my face in my hands, and cried with the full release of someone who has been rationing that particular expenditure for a long time and has finally arrived at a moment that justifies the cost. Not grief, not fear. The very specific emotion of a person who has spent 2 years and nearly everything they had on a proposition that everyone around them called wrong and has just received in the form of a functioning room in a minus 30-degree storm, the final answer to the question. Agnes had been right about every number. Outside, the storm continued its argument, with the territory indifferent to what was being proven inside a single cabin in a draw 9 miles from the nearest town. The temperature dropped further through the small hours, reaching the lowest point at around 4 in the morning. I measured it by holding the thermometer outside the cracked window for 5 full minutes and drawing it back in before the mercury could equalize. 47 degrees below zero. The number was almost abstract, the kind of figure that requires a physical reference to understand. I had read in a farming journal once that at 40 below, exposed skin freezes in under a minute, and any moisture in the air crystallizes before it can be breathed in without discomfort. The journal had been clinical about it, the way scientific writing is clinical, and I had found the clinical tone inadequate then, and found it more so now, standing in a 12 by 14-foot room that registered 51 degrees above zero at floor level near the stove. 98 degrees of difference between the outside of the wall and the inside of the room. Not magic. Physics. The physics of dead air and low thermal conductivity, and a woman who had understood 30 years before I arrived that the answer to a thin wall was not a thicker one, but a smarter one. I pulled a piece of wood from the innermost course of the north wall, the first piece of fuel I'd taken from the system, rather than from the exterior supply, and fed it to the stove. The piece had been part of the wall since the previous summer. It had done its insulating work. Now it would do the other thing. I watched it catch and thought about the economy of it, the double use that Agnes had designed into the system from the beginning. Nothing wasted, nothing single-purposed. The same material serving two functions in sequence, and the sequence being everything. I did not know yet what was happening in Medora. I would not know for 2 more days, and I would learn it in pieces from the people who came to my door. The shallow hand pump wells that most of the town's families relied on froze on the second day, the ice forming in the pipes faster than it could be cleared with boiling water, because the ambient temperature outside the ground was so far below freezing that any surface pipe froze again within minutes of being cleared. Families melted snow for water and used the fuel they had been saving for heat to boil it, and the double expenditure against a supply that had seemed adequate in October began to show its arithmetic by the end of the 3rd day. The livestock died in a pattern that followed the quality of the outbuildings. Horses in tight, well-built barns with banked straw survived. Horses in structures that had a gap under a door or a missing chinking section on the windward side did not. The Holbrook family lost their milk cow on the 2nd day, finding her standing in the southeast corner of the lean-to shed, where she'd pressed herself away from the wind, her legs locked at the joints, dead without having fallen. Ruth Danby's boarding house had 7 residents through the storm and a kitchen stove that was adequate for normal winters and not for this one. The kitchen wall faced northwest, and its chinking had been a maintenance item Danby had been planning to address in the spring for 2 consecutive years. The cold came through it not as a draft, but as a presence, a systematic lowering of the room temperature that the stove fought and did not win. By the 4th night, the temperature in the main gathering room had dropped below freezing after the stove had been burning for 3 continuous hours which was the moment Danby understood that burning more wood was not going to solve the problem, that the problem was structural, and that she had no remaining options she had not already tried. The Holbrook family's situation was worse. The addition they'd built onto the west side of their house 4 years earlier had been constructed quickly and with materials that were available rather than materials that were correct, and the intersection between the old wall and the new one had never sealed properly. The northwest wind found that junction with the precision of something that had been waiting for exactly this temperature differential to make itself fully known, and the draft it created reversed the draw in their stove, filling the room with smoke and forcing a choice between cold and suffocation. They chose cold and opened a window on the leeward side and huddled their 3 children under every piece of fabric they owned, and while the parents took turns feeding the fire from outside the room through the window opening and trying to find an angle that would let the stove draw correctly without forcing smoke back in. The schoolhouse held through day 3 on the strength of its construction and lost the battle on day 4 when the fuel ran short. The teacher had planned for a 2-week supply, and the storm had already run 6 days without any sign of relenting. 2 of the younger children showed the particular lethargy and cessation of shivering that anyone who had read the right agricultural journals would have recognized as the body's preparation for hypothermia, rather than a sign of improvement. And the teacher who had not read those journals mistook the quiet for recovery and added it to his list of things to be grateful for. Silas Rowan's shelter barn held 40 people on its peak night, which was the 5th night charging $2 per adult and $1 per child for the privilege of sleeping on straw in a space designed for freight and not for families. The barn was warm. Rowan had built it with commercial-grade chinking and a stove sized for the volume, and his investment in the structure had been genuine, even if his pricing was not charitable. On the 6th night, sometime between 11 and midnight, a family in the northwest corner who had been feeding a small, portable brazier they'd brought from home because the floor space near the central stove had been taken, and the brazier was warmer than nothing, set a piece of loose straw alight with a dropped coal. The fire moved through the straw bedding of the entire northwest quarter of the barn in under 4 minutes, which was long enough for everyone to get out and not long enough for anyone to save their belongings. Rowan lost the barn in 2 hours. It burned down to its foundation posts in a column of fire and smoke, visible from the draw, though I did not see it until the following morning when I opened the door to check the exterior thermometer and saw the smudge on the sky to the north. That meant something large had burned. 40 people in Medora were now without emergency shelter in the 6th day of a storm that showed no intention of concluding. Walt appeared at my door on the afternoon of the 5th day before the barn fire, before I had any information about the town's condition. He came from the north along the draw trail, moving at the pace of someone whose hip was locked and who had decided not to acknowledge this as a reason to slow down. He was carrying a child. The child was 5 years old, the youngest boarder at Danby's house, a girl named Maisie, whose parents had sent her to Medora to stay with relatives and had not been able to retrieve her before the storm closed the roads. The child was wrapped in so many layers of blanket and coating that her arms could not reach her sides, and she was awake and calm in the way that small children are sometimes calm in extraordinary situations, as though the severity of circumstances had simplified the world to something manageable. Walt handed the child to me at the door. His face had the color of a man who has been outside in 40 below temperatures for longer than was survivable for someone with compromised lungs, which was a color between gray and something that had no good name. He stepped across the threshold and I stepped back to make room, and he made it 4 more steps into the room, and then his legs decided they were finished, and he went down, not all at once, but in sections, first to his knees, and then sideways against the north wall, his shoulder hitting the face of the stacked wood, and his weight settling against it in a way that would have toppled an unbraced stack, but did not topple this one. I got Maisie onto the sleeping platform with 2 of the blankets from the bundle Walt had wrapped her in. I got Walt's coat off him and got the remaining blankets over him and got the stove loaded and the water pot on, and did all of this in the order that mattered, rather than the order that felt urgent, which was a distinction I'd learned from 20 years of managing schoolrooms where several things needed attention simultaneously, and the order of address determined whether any of them got resolved. Walt was breathing. His color was bad, but his eyes were open and tracking, and when I pressed 2 fingers to his wrist, his pulse was present and had a character I associated with exhaustion rather than with failure. I held the cup of warm water to his lips when it was ready, and he drank it in small amounts, and between amounts, he said, his voice reduced to something that required close listening to catch. "The system works, I can feel it. The room is holding." I told him he would tell people that himself when the storm was over, and he looked at me with an expression that was not disagreement exactly, but that contained within it the knowledge of a man who has been in enough hard situations to be able to read the difference between the ones with more time in them and the ones that are approaching their conclusion. "I have seen what I needed to see," he said, and I did not argue because I recognized that arguing would have been for my benefit rather than his. That night, with Walt on the sleeping platform and Maisie asleep in a nest of blankets on the floor near the stove, I made the decision that would later be described as the moment the story became something larger than one woman's winner. The cabin was warm. The system worked. The room could hold more than myself. Outside 9 miles north, the town I had left 2 years ago, under the sound of 9 people laughing, was failing in ways that my sister had predicted and my work had solved, and I was not going to sit inside a working solution while the problem it addressed killed the people who had laughed at it. This decision was not heroic in the way that heroism is typically rendered. It was more like the resolution of an equation whose variables had all finally been assigned their values. I had the answer. The people who needed the answer were 9 miles away in the dark and the cold. The only question was the order of operations. Ruth Danby came to me on the morning of the 7th day, having made the walk from Medora in conditions that had already killed livestock and would kill unprepared people, driven by the specific desperation of a woman who has run out of options and has arrived reluctantly at the one she had been refusing for 2 years. She stood at the door with windburn across her cheekbones and her jaw set in the expression of someone who was about to ask for something that cost her more than it would have cost her not to need it. "I cannot keep my borders warm." Each word measured. "My walls are failing, and my wood is running short, and I have 2 children showing symptoms I don't know how to interpret. I am not asking for charity." She paused on that word long enough to mark it as important. "I am asking whether you can show me what to do." The distinction mattered to her, and I honored it. "Bring your north wall wood in first. Split face inward. Leave a consistent gap between the wood and your log wall, width of your hand, no more than that. The gap traps still air. Still air doesn't carry heat away because it doesn't move." I was already putting on my coat. "I'll come with you." The boarding house was dying when we arrived. Frost flowering on the interior surface of the northwest kitchen wall, the stove running at capacity and losing ground. I walked the room and identified the walls in order of urgency and told Danby's 2 male boarders what to stack and where and at what dimensions. And I stood at the corner of the north kitchen wall and supervised the first 3 courses going in, and then moved to the second wall while the first crew continued. And by the time the afternoon light started failing, 2 walls were done and the room temperature had stabilized, and then within the hour had begun to rise. Not dramatically, not by 30 degrees in the first hour, by 5 degrees, which was more than the stove alone had managed in 6 days of trying. The Holbrook family came the following morning with their 3 children and their story of the window feeding and the smoke, and I sent Walt's carpenter tools, which he had not forbidden me from using, and which I did not think he would have, with 2 men from the boarding house who owed their current warmth to my instruction, and the group went to the Holbrook house and built the west wall and sealed the junction between the old construction and the new addition with a combination of stacked wood and the clay fiber packing I'd learned from Agnes's 7th notebook. The junction sealed, the draft reversed. The family came in from the cold they'd been standing in to tend their own fire and sat down in a warm room for the first time in 7 days, and the youngest Holbrook child, who was 4, fell asleep in front of the stove within 20 minutes. The school teacher arrived that afternoon. Then 2 of Rowan's former shelter barn customers, sent by their wives who had heard through the chain of information that moves faster than any formal communication through a community in crisis, that Danby's house was warm and that the woman from the draw had shown them how. Then 3 families who had not been to the boarding house but who had relatives there and had followed the instructions secondhand with enough accuracy to get their worst wall done and enough uncertainty about the details to want confirmation. Then the families who had been in the room at Mercer and Vale Mercantile in October of 1885. I recognized them and helped them without ceremony without requiring anything from them in exchange, without allowing myself the comfort of noting the symmetry between their laughter then and their need now. I gave to the Peterson family, who had told me I was too old to be living alone in the territory. I gave to the family whose patriarch had seconded Mercer's observation about the 12 acres of wind and laughed the longest. I gave my best seasoned box elder to a family I could not look at without remembering the specific sound of their amusement in that back room, and I stacked it against their worst wall in the knowledge that the wood did not care who it had previously warmed or whether that person deserved warming. Walt watched all of this from the sleeping platform when he was able to sit up, which by the 8th day he was. His color had improved from the near white of his arrival to something that suggested his body had decided provisionally to continue. He watched me send out the last of the box elder and said, "They don't deserve it." His voice still carried the rasp of a man whose lungs had been through something they hadn't entirely recovered from, but the precision was back in it, the quality of a statement made with full awareness of its content. I was tired in a way that had moved past the physical into something more systemic. Not the ache of muscles, but the accumulated cost of 12 days of cold and sustained effort and the emotional expenditure of giving repeatedly to people who had not given to me. "Some of them probably don't," I said, "but the cold doesn't distinguish between the cruel and the generous, and I won't learn cruelty from the weather." I was quiet for a moment, and then I said the thing I had been thinking since the night the system had proven itself, the thing that Agnes had written in the 12th Winter Notebook, and that had clarified for me everything the work had been, for the wood was never mine. Agnes left it to be used. Walt was quiet for a long time after that. When he spoke, his voice had changed in the way voices change when something has settled, rather than when something has resolved. "Agnes would have been proud of you," he said. "She would not have said so directly, but she would have found a reason to show you the best section of the cottonwood stand and pretended it was purely practical." On the 9th day, Silas Roan sent a wagon load of wood to the draw. He sent it without a note, left it at the entrance to the track below the cabin, and turned his team around before anyone came out to receive it. The driver told someone in Medora afterward that Rowan had said, without particular expression, that a bad idea had managed to outlast the storm, which was as close to admission as he had ever come about anything, and which would have to serve as the final word on the subject because no further word ever followed. He did not apologize, and he did not reverse his pricing, and he never directly acknowledged to me or to anyone in my presence that the system had worked or that he had known it would. But the wood was at the bottom of the track, and he had put it there. The storm broke on the 12th day. The temperature rose 40 degrees in 18 hours, which was almost exactly the temperature rise of the Chinook that had shifted my doorside wall in October of 1886, and the contrast between those two events, the Chinook that had frightened me and the thaw that ended 12 days of survival, contained within it a kind of compressed summary of everything the 2 years of work had been. The Chinook had shown me a failure mode I hadn't anticipated, and I had built the answer to it before the real test arrived. That was the whole story in miniature. 4 people died in Medora during those 12 days. 2 from cold exposure, a man who had been caught outside when the temperature dropped on the first night and had not made it back to shelter, and an elderly woman who had not been able to keep her stove lit when her arthritis made it impossible to operate the damper. 1 from a house fire unrelated to the storm, which had started before the cold set in. 1 from a heart stopped by the effort of shoveling ice from a doorway on the morning of the 7th day. 4 people in the worst winter in 50 years of Dakota Territory weather in a town of 400 in conditions that should by every prior measure have killed 10 times that number. Mrs. Ada Mercer came in March when the roads had thawed enough for a hired sleigh to manage the tracks south from town. I was outside checking the seasoning shed when the sleigh appeared at the draw entrance, the same black bombazine dress, the same set to the jaw, the same document box, now wrapped in a wool shawl against the residual cold. What was different was the way she walked carefully, as though placing each step with more attention than usual, as though the ground could not entirely be trusted. She asked to come inside. I stepped aside without hesitation, not because I had forgotten or forgiven anything in advance, but because the cabin had been built to be open, not to be kept, and closing it now as a demonstration of remembered injury would have been a misuse of what it was. Mercer stood in the center of the room and looked at the walls in silence. The inner surface of the wood system bore the marks of 12 days of systematic burning, dark charred patches at intervals along each wall, where I had drawn foam from the innermost courses in careful sections, preserving the dead airspace behind while using what the wall had to offer. The floor runners, the ceiling cleats, the corner battens, the willow lashing. The entire constructed argument that Agnes had begun and I had completed, and the storm of January 1888 had proven. Mercer stood and looked at it for a long time without speaking, and when she finally spoke, her voice had the quality of something that has been prepared and is being delivered as composed rather than as felt. I said something cruel the day I read the will. Her eyes remained on the walls rather than on me. I believed that practical honesty was a form of kindness I was performing for you. I believed that a woman in your position needed to understand her limitations, rather than to pursue what I considered an impractical hope. She paused. I was wrong about the hope, and I was wrong about the kindness. I did not answer because there was nothing to add to that, and adding nothing was the correct response. Mercer opened the document box. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilskin, were two envelopes. I recognized Agnes's handwriting on each one before Mercer said anything further, but these were not the draft copies I had found in the pine box 3 years earlier. Those had been clean unsealed, retained for Agnes's own record. These envelopes had been sealed and handled. The paper was slightly compressed at the edges from years spent in a desk drawer, and one corner of the outer envelope bore a faint ink mark I recognized as the kind left by a postal agent's thumb. These had traveled. These were the originals. These came through the postal agency in 1879 and 1882. Mercer held them out. I did not forward them. I held them because I believed that giving a failing claim and a dead woman's scientific notebooks to a widow of your age was another form of negligence, dressed as inheritance. I told myself I was protecting you from false hope. She paused again, longer this time. I kept them because Agnes's handwriting looked important. I did not read them, which is not a defense. Not reading them was its own decision. I took the letters. I held the originals and felt their weight, which was not the weight of paper. It was the weight of what Agnes had intended, and what the misdirection of two envelopes had cost, not property, not opportunity, but years. The years Agnes had sat in this room waiting for a response that never came. The years I had spent arranged into other people's spare spaces without knowing I had been called for. I had read the drafts and understood the content. But holding the originals, the ones Agnes had sealed with her own hands and sent north, trusting they would arrive, was a different thing. The drafts were what Agnes had written. The originals were what Agnes had trusted. I forgive you, I said. The words were direct and without performance, the way I had always taught my students to read aloud clearly, without editorial addition, letting the sentence carry its own weight. Not because what you did was without consequence. It had consequences that Agnes died without seeing resolved, and that I spent years paying for without knowing why. I forgive you because I would rather keep this room at its working temperature than fill it with what should have been. I looked at Mercer for the first time since she had entered. That is not a small thing I'm offering. I want you to understand that. Mercer's hands were trembling when she replaced the lid on the document box. She was a woman who had held herself in a particular posture for a very long time, and the posture was still present, but something inside it had shifted the way a wall shifts when a load-bearing element is quietly removed. She stayed for another hour. We spoke about practical matters, the spring work, the wood supply, the community building I was planning from Agnes's hidden specifications. When Mercer left and her sleigh had disappeared around the first bend in the draw track, I stood in the doorway for a moment and listened to the sound of the meltwater running off the clay ridges into the creek bed, and thought about forgiveness as a structural choice rather than an emotional one. The room was warm behind me. That was the argument I chose to make with the space I had. Walt died in September of 1888, in the last summer warmth, in the chair that had been Agnes's before it was his to occupy whenever he came to the draw. I found him in the afternoon, his right hand resting on the peg gauge he'd been cutting a spacing tool for wall construction, one of 3 he was making to give to families who had asked for them. The soup I'd left inside for him when I went to the shed that morning was on the table beside the chair, untouched and cool. His face was peaceful in the specific way of someone who has arrived at the end of their work rather than the interruption of it. Not absence, completion. I buried him on the rise above the draw where the land opened toward the river, and a person could see both the cabin roof and the bend in the Little Missouri where the current ran clear in low water. I planted wild plum cuttings around the grave in a ring because he had said once watching me clear brush from the south slope that this country deserved at least one stubborn, beautiful thing that came back every April without being asked. The cuttings took. They came back every April for as long as I tended the draw and for years after. He left me his carpenter's chest and the small freight shed he owned at the north end of Medora's main street, transferred by a handwritten document he'd filed at the county clerk's office sometime in the spring without telling me. The shed became my workshop. When I cleared the shed of Walt's personal effects in the first week of October, I found the notebook at the back of the lower shelf behind a canvas roll of chisels and a tin of linseed oil. Agnes's handwriting on the cover. The words beneath it read, "The next step." Inside, in the same small, even hand as everything Agnes had ever committed to paper, were sketches and calculations and detailed notes for the application of the wall system to a community structure. Not a single-room cabin, but a large single-story building, a public space large enough to serve as emergency shelter for a significant portion of a small town's population, designed with the dead air insulation principle built into its architecture from the foundation rather than added after the fact. Agnes had worked out the load calculations for a structure 3 times the size of her own cabin. She had specified the wood species she preferred for the interior shell and provided substitutes for each ranked by thermal performance. She had left at the bottom of the final page a note that read, "I will not build this, but someone will." I sat on Walt's workbench with the notebook open in my hands and understood what Agnes had been doing for 22 winters in the Medora breaks. Not surviving, not retreating, not going strange and solitary, because the world had been unkind. Laying foundations, building a structure of knowledge that was intended to outlast her and did outlast her, and had in the winter just past been deployed at a scale Agnes had designed for but never lived to see. The cabin had been the prototype. The notebooks had been the transmission. I had been the continuation. And this notebook, hidden in a freight shed with Walt as its keeper, was the commission, the next phase of a project whose original architect was 22 notebooks and one terrible winter into proving her point. The community building went up in the spring of 1891, built on the lot behind the schoolhouse with lumber donated from 4 different sources, including Silas Rowan, who contributed without being asked and without comment and attended the framing day with his 2 strongest employees and worked from morning until the light failed. Nobody made a speech about his contribution, and he did not appear to expect one. The structure was built to Agnes's specifications with modifications I had developed with Walt, and it incorporated the insulated wall system as a permanent architectural feature rather than an emergency addition. The interior dead air space was framed into the walls at the time of construction the way you would frame a window or a doorway, as a designed element, not a retrofit. Dr. Carr wrote an account of its construction for the Territorial Agricultural paper, citing Agnes Holt as the system's originator and me as its developer in that order, which was the correct order and the one I had specified when Carr asked. The paper reached Bismarck, where William read it. He wrote a letter shortly afterward that began with the right words in the right order and ended with something it had not contained in any of his previous letters, an acknowledgement that he had been wrong. Not elaborated, not explained, just stated. He said he had read the account twice and understood on the second reading what I had been doing and why. He said he was sorry he had underlined the word home. I wrote back a letter of 5 pages, the longest I had written to anyone in years, and in it I described the draw and the cabin and the work and Agnes and Walt and the winter of 1888 with the same precision Agnes had brought to the temperature tables in the notebooks, because it was a story that deserved to be told accurately, and I was old enough to know that accuracy was its own form of love. The years that followed had the quality of a life that has found its proper form. I winterized houses across the county, traveling by wagon in the autumns. Before the hard weather came assessing structures and making recommendations, and sometimes staying long enough to supervise the first courses of the wall system going in. I taught the method to anyone who asked and to several people who hadn't known to ask because they didn't know the question was available. I wrote a practical manual with Dr. Carr that went through 2 printings and was stocked at 3 county agricultural offices and at the Medora schoolhouse where it lived on the reference shelf between a cattle vaccination guide and a seed germination table. The manual listed Agnes's name on the cover page above my own in larger type. This had been my decision, and Carr had not argued with it. My hands changed across the years in ways that hands change when they are used for their purpose. The calluses settled into permanent geography. The knuckles thickened. The carpenter's rule lived in my coat pocket through every working season, and I knew its markings the way I had known the multiplication tables in the early years of teaching, not by consulting them, but by carrying them. Wow. The schoolhouse in Medora added the Holt method to its science curriculum sometime in the mid-1890s, framed as a lesson in applied thermodynamics with diagrams on the board and temperature measurements taken during the practical sessions in the fall. The students learned the vocabulary, thermal conductivity, convective, transfer, dead air insulation, and they learned it correctly, which was more than had been available to Agnes in her time or to me in mine. What the curriculum did not teach, because curricula cannot teach it, was the sound of 9 people laughing in a room that smelled of tobacco and old sawdust, while a woman stood with 93 cents in her coat pocket and received the news that she had inherited something worthless. It did not teach what it felt like to read a sentence written by a dead woman's hand and feel the sentence land in the exact place inside you where it had been aimed. It did not teach the weight of 2 undelivered originals sitting in a desk drawer, or the cost of 22 winters spent solving a problem that had needed 2 people to complete and had received only 1 for reasons that fitted in a single word withheld. What saves you in a hard country is often the thing people laugh at before they understand it. Agnes had written that in her 12th winter alone on a claim that everyone in Medora called a joke, in the year that I was 43 years old and teaching multiplication tables to other people's children 60 miles north without knowing I had been called for. The sentence was in the curriculum. The curriculum had not yet found a way to teach what it costs to be the person who wrote it before the understanding arrived. I died on a morning in March of 1921 in the workshop off the north end of Medora's main street, seated on the low stool I had used for close work since the early years when my knees had begun to express opinions about prolonged kneeling. A demonstration wall had been half finished on the bench beside me. A teaching model, 3 courses complete, the 4th laid out and waiting for the 5th. A single piece of split cottonwood rested across my lap, balanced as though I had set it down for a moment and intended to pick it back up. My daughter, who had come to bring me the midday meal and found me in the afternoon light of the south window, said afterward that I looked occupied rather than absent, the way a person looks when they are in the middle of something that matters, and have paused briefly to think about the next step. The cabin in the drawer still stands. Agnes's notebooks are in a glass front cabinet in the main room, visible from the doorway, available to anyone who comes to look. On the wall beside the cabinet hangs a cross-section taken from the original interior wood shell during a structural repair. In 1912, a slice of the system as it had existed on the morning of January 14, 1888, when the outside temperature was 47 below zero, and the inside of a 12 by 14-foot cabin recorded 51 degrees above a difference of 98 degrees across a wall of stacked split cottonwood that everyone in Medora had called a joke right up until the moment it saved their lives. The cut section is scorched in places along its interior face where the winter of 1888 was burned 1 course at a time in the order the system required. The scorch marks are not uniform. They follow the sequence of withdrawal: innermost course first, then the next, the fuel serving as insulation until the moment it was needed as fire, the distinction between those 2 functions being only a matter of timing and nothing else. Agnes had understood this 30 years before the storm. She had sat alone in a failing room and worked out the physics and built the answer and recorded every measurement and written the thing that was true. The wood has to become the wall before it becomes the fire, and the order of that cannot be reversed without cost. She had wanted someone with the right kind of mind to hear it. She had written letters. The letters had been held. The mind arrived anyway.